She hadn't said a single word in 742 days. Not when the doctors pressed cold stethoscopes to her throat and declared her vocal cords perfectly intact. Not when therapists set stuffed animals on the carpet and asked her to point at the one that felt sad. Not when her mother, a woman who had stared down boardrooms full of men twice her age and never once blinked, knelt on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m. and whispered, "Please, baby, just say mama, just once." 6-year-old Lila Ashford sat through all of it with the same distant eyes, the same small hands folded in her lap, and the same silence so complete it had begun to feel like a living thing inside their home. Then a stranger with a worn coin in his pocket told her a story about sailors and lighthouses, and everything changed. If this is your first time here, welcome, and please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it is worth every minute. The Ashford name meant something in Chicago. It meant the 43rd floor of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue where the conference rooms smelled like leather and fresh-cut flowers, and the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. It meant a portfolio of 7 companies, 3 of them acquired before Celeste Vaughn Ashford turned 32. It meant a name on hospital wings and university endowment funds, and the short list of people whose calls got returned the same day. What it did not mean, what no profile in Forbes or Crane's Chicago business had ever been willing to print, because Celeste controlled her own narrative the way she controlled everything else, was a mother sitting in the parking garage of Northwestern Memorial at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, gripping her steering wheel with both hands, unable to go upstairs and face another session that ended in silence. That had been 8 months ago. Things had not improved. Tonight was the Meridian Children's Foundation Gala. Black tie. 400 guests. A ballroom on the 32nd floor of the Langham Hotel with a view of the river and a silent auction that would raise somewhere north of $2 million before midnight. Celeste had chaired the event for 3 consecutive years. She had a table at the front, a speech prepared, and a daughter who was supposed to be upstairs in the suite with the babysitter. Supposed to be. She was standing at the floor-length mirror in the hotel suite at 6:47 p.m., fighting with her left earring, when she noticed Lila in the reflection. The girl was sitting on the edge of the bed in her blue dress, the one with the small white buttons up the front that she'd picked herself, which still meant something, because choosing things was progress. Watching her mother with those careful, serious eyes that always made Celeste feel like she was being quietly evaluated. "You look beautiful," Celeste said, to herself as much as to Lila. Lila said nothing. She blinked once, slowly, the way she did when she was listening hard. The babysitter, a college junior named Priya, who had a gift for patience and a minor in child psychology, appeared in the doorway. "We've got the tablet, the snacks she likes, and I downloaded 2 movies. We're going to be completely fine up here." Celeste looked at her daughter. Lila looked back. "I'll be downstairs," Celeste said. "Priya has my number. If you need me—" She stopped herself. "If you need me" was a phrase that required a response, and Lila did not give responses. Her therapist, Dr. Anita Pham, had spent 6 months gently walking Celeste away from questions and conditional sentences toward statements. "I love you. I'm nearby. You're safe." Simple declarations that didn't put the weight of communication on a child who had decided, somewhere deep in whatever place fear goes when it's too large to carry, that speaking was no longer worth the risk. "I love you," Celeste said instead. "I'll check in at 9. She kissed Lila on the top of her head, felt the small body neither lean in nor pull away. Neutral, always neutral, the careful stillness of a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible, and walked out. In the elevator going down, she checked her phone. 3 messages from her VP of Acquisitions, 1 from her attorney, and a text from the gala coordinator asking if she'd reviewed the revised seating chart. She answered 2 of them before the doors opened on the lobby level, where the sound of a string quartet and 400 conversations hit her like weather. This was where Celeste Vaughn was comfortable. This was the version of herself she knew how to be. She found her table, greeted the foundation director, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, and began doing the work that these events required. The handshakes, the introductions, the 30-second versions of conversations that were really just relationship maintenance in formal wear. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Even tonight, with the familiar low-grade ache sitting behind her sternum the way it always did at events where other parents brought their children, and the children talked and laughed and needed things and got them. She was in a conversation with a city alderman about the foundation's literacy initiative when her phone buzzed. Priya. Hey, don't panic, but Lila wandered out of the suite. I think she followed a hotel staff member who knocked on the wrong door. I've been looking for about 4 minutes. I'm so sorry. Calling security now. Celeste was already moving. She crossed the ballroom in under 90 seconds, heels be damned, cutting through clusters of guests with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly how many seconds were already gone. She flagged down the nearest hotel security officer, young, maybe 25, with a radio clipped to his jacket, and gave him Lila's description in 8 words: 6, blue dress with white buttons, dark hair. Then she headed for the service corridor behind the main stage, because that was where she would have gone at 6 years old if she'd wanted to find somewhere quiet. She was almost right. Mason Ryder had worked hotel security for 4 months. Before that, he'd done 3 months at a logistics warehouse in Cicero. Before that, 2 months driving for a private car service. Before that, before the job hopping that his sister called running and he called adjusting, he had spent 11 years as a United States Navy SEAL, 3 of them at a classification level that still made certain conversations go quiet if the wrong people were in the room. That was done now. He was done. He had left that life on a rainy highway outside of Antwerp when the convoy he was protecting turned into something else, and he had made it out, and not everyone had. He didn't think about Antwerp. He had gotten very good at not thinking about Antwerp. Tonight he was stationed at the perimeter of the event space, which meant he spent most of the night doing slow circuits of the hallways adjacent to the ballroom, checking stairwell doors and watching for guests who looked lost or unwell. It was not complicated work. It was work that kept his hands busy and his schedule full, and his son, Declan, in a school with a decent aftercare program and a soccer league that ran through the spring. Declan was 8. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of going very quiet when something was bothering him, which was the kind of thing Mason noticed because he recognized it from the inside. His wife, Karen, had died 3.5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 13 months from diagnosis to the end. Declan had been 4. He didn't ask about her as much as he used to, and Mason wasn't sure whether that was healing or just the shape grief takes when it becomes ordinary. I was rounding the corner near the service corridor at the back of the stage, a narrow hallway with gray carpeting and fluorescent lighting, lined with equipment cases and folded banquet chairs, when he saw the girl. She was standing very still at the far end of the hallway, looking at a fire exit door like she was considering it. Mason stopped walking. He had been in enough situations where rushing toward something small and frightened made everything worse. He assessed from where he was, 6 years old, maybe 7. Dark hair and a careful braid coming loose at the bottom. Blue dress with buttons up the front, one of them slightly crooked, like she'd done them herself or someone had been in a hurry. No shoes. She was in little white socks, which meant she'd been somewhere she thought she'd be staying. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that put him on alert more than anything else would have. A crying child was scared. A silent child that still was this. Still was somewhere further down than scared. He'd seen it before. Not in hotels. He took 3 steps forward, unhurried, and then crouched down before she could register him as someone coming toward her. At his height, 6'2", broad across the shoulders, in a way that the gray jacket only partially concealed, he had learned a long time ago that staying low was the difference between a conversation and a flight response. "Hey," he said. Quiet. Not a question. The girl turned to look at him. Not startled. She'd heard him coming. She just hadn't run. Her eyes were dark brown and very serious, and they moved over his face in the particular way of children who have learned to read adults for danger. Mason had spent years learning to make himself readable as safe. No sudden movements, no wide smiles that felt forced, no leaning in. He just stayed where he was, at her level, far enough away that she had room. "I think you might have gotten turned around," he said. "Easy to do back here. I've done it myself a couple times, and I actually work here." Nothing. She watched him. "My name's Mason." He didn't offer his hand. "I'm one of the security guys, which mostly means I walk around a lot and try to look like I know where I'm going." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, with his eyes still on hers so she could see exactly what he was doing, and took out the coin. It was a Navy Challenge coin, worn smooth on the eagle's wings from years of being turned between his fingers. He'd carried it since his first deployment. He set it on the floor between them, not offering it, just placing it where she could see it. You know what that is? She looked at it. It's a challenge coin. Every branch of the military has them. You get one when you've done something, finished training, completed a mission, whatever. You're supposed to carry it with you. He paused. Mine's from a long time ago. I just keep it because it's become a habit. She was still looking at the coin. Not at him now. At the coin. He turned it over with one finger so she could see the other side, the anchor, the eagle, the small text running the perimeter that was worn past reading. I used to tell a story about this coin, he said, to kids, when I was overseas. He hadn't meant to say that part. It came out anyway. There were sometimes kids in the places we were working, and they'd be scared. Adults too, but adults are better at pretending. Kids can't pretend the way adults can. He shrugged slightly. So I'd tell them a story about sailors who got lost. The hallway was very quiet. From somewhere far away came the muffled sound of the quartet playing something slow and formal. The sailors had been at sea for a long time, Mason said. Not performing it, just saying it, the way he'd said it before, in worse places, to kids who had less reason to feel safe than this one did. Long enough that they started to forget what land smelled like. Started to wonder if they'd gotten the direction wrong, if maybe they'd been going the wrong way the whole time. The ocean doesn't give you a lot of feedback. It just keeps being the ocean. The girl had turned back to look at him. But there was this one sailor, not the captain, not anybody important, just a regular guy who'd been on deck long enough that his eyes had adjusted to the dark. And he saw it first. The light. On the cliff. Just blinking, slow and steady. Mason demonstrated with one finger, tapping a slow rhythm on the carpet. On, off, on, off. Not a big light, just enough. And he said, "Hey, I see something." And the other sailor said, "You're imagining it." And he said, "Maybe." But he kept watching anyway. Lila had drifted closer. He hadn't seen her move. She was 2 feet away now instead of 5, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, her eyes on his face. Did they make it home? The words were so quiet that Mason, who had trained to hear things other people missed, almost didn't catch them. He went absolutely still. He knew, in the way that you know certain things without being able to explain how, that something significant had just happened. Not because a child had spoken, though that alone would have meant something to him, given Declan's first months after Karen died, the weeks of near silence that the grief counselor had said were normal, but that had felt like anything but. It was something else. Something in the quality of the question, like it had been waiting for a very specific door. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice even with some effort. "They made it home." She nodded, slowly, once. "Tell me the rest." "What?" Celeste heard her daughter's voice before she reached the hallway. She almost didn't recognize it, not because it was different. It was exactly Lila's voice, the same pitch, the same slight softness on the consonants that she'd had since she was 2, but because she hadn't heard it in so long that her brain briefly refused to accept the signal. She stopped walking. One of the hotel's security officers, a young woman who'd been guiding her toward the service area, stopped too. "Tell me the rest." Celeste put one hand on the wall. She turned the corner. The hallway was narrow and gray lit, and at the far end of it was her daughter in the blue dress, sitting cross-legged on the floor 6 inches from a man Celeste had never seen before. He was big, the kind of big that should have been alarming in a poorly lit back corridor. Crouched down with his elbows on his knees, turning something small between his fingers. He was talking in a low, even voice. Lila was watching him like he was the only thing in the room. Every protective instinct in Celeste's body fired at once. "Lila." She crossed the hallway in 5 steps. The man looked up immediately, hands visible, no sudden movement. The deliberate stillness of someone who'd clocked her as alarmed and was managing it. "Lila, come here, baby." Lila looked up at her mother, then back at the man. Then she reached out and picked up the coin he'd set on the floor, picking it up, not being handed it, and stood. "He was telling me a story," she said. Celeste's heart stopped. No. It restarted, loudly. She felt it. In the 2 years since the night on the highway, since the accident, the gunfire, the SUV, the things she still couldn't say out loud in its full form, because saying it in full meant living inside it, Lila had not strung a sentence together for anyone. Not for Dr. Pham. Not for the two specialists they'd flown in from Boston and London. Not for Celeste. On any of the nights she'd sat on the edge of Lila's bed in the dark and told her it was okay, you can talk when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere, I promise. He was telling me a story. Subject, verb, object. Past continuous. Said with the ease of someone who hadn't spent 2 years measuring out every sound. Celeste looked at the man. Really looked at him. He'd straightened up slowly, keeping distance between himself and her, badge visible on his jacket. Hotel security. Late 30s. A face that had some mileage on it, the kind of quiet steadiness that didn't come from things going well. She wandered back here, he said. I found her looking at the exit door. We were just talking. He paused. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I didn't want to leave her alone. He told me about the sailors, Lila said. She was holding the coin. They found the lighthouse. Celeste looked at her daughter. Lila looked back, and for the first time in 742 days, the careful distance was gone from her eyes. She looked like herself. She looked like the child Celeste remembered from before, the one who used to narrate everything. Car trips, grocery stores, the plots of picture books in exhaustive, joyful detail. The one who had a question for everything and expected an answer. Celeste's composure, the one she had maintained through board meetings and legal depositions and grief that had no clean shape, broke along a seam she hadn't known was there. She knelt down on the gray carpet in her gala dress and pulled her daughter against her, and Lila, for the first time in a very long time, held on. Over her daughter's shoulder, Celeste looked up at the man with the coin. He'd stepped back to give them space. His expression was careful and quiet, the look of someone who understood that this moment was not his. Thank you, she managed. He nodded once, not making it into anything. She would learn his name in a few minutes when she found her voice again. She would learn it and write it down and look it up, and spend the next 3 weeks unable to explain to anyone why a stranger telling her daughter a story about sailors had broken something loose that 2 years and 4 specialists and every resource her money could reach had failed to touch. But that would come later. Right now, Lila was talking. Right now, in a gray service hallway lit by fluorescent lights, with the sound of a string quartet drifting in from somewhere far away, Celeste held her daughter and felt something she had almost given up on entirely. She felt like they were going to be okay. Somewhere across the hallway, the man with the coin stood quietly against the wall, watching a little girl finally come home, and the color had drained from his face completely, because he had heard Lila say one thing, one small detail, buried inside her memory like a splinter. A detail so specific, so impossible for a stranger to know, that his chest had gone cold from the inside. He knew that story. He knew it because he'd told it before. Not tonight, not here, on a rainy highway, 3 years ago. To a terrified little girl he'd held in his arms in the dark, while the world around them was on fire. Mason needed a minute. He told himself that's what it was. 1 minute, just to get his head straight. But the truth was, he stood in that gray hallway long after Celeste had carried Lila back toward the elevator, long after the young female security officer had given him a sideways look and moved on, long after the sounds of the gala had swelled and then softened again as the doors swung shut somewhere down the corridor. He stood there with his back against the wall and his hands loose at his sides, and he did the thing he'd trained himself to do when the ground shifted without warning. He breathed. He counted. He looked for the facts. Fact. A 6-year-old girl had spoken to him tonight after apparently not speaking for a significant stretch of time. Fact. The story he'd told her was the same story he'd told a different child, or what he'd believed at the time was a different child, on a Belgian highway on a wet October night 3 years ago. Fact. He did not know yet if those 2 children were the same person. That last one was the one he kept circling, because the alternative, the version where they were the same child, where the terrified 3-year-old he'd pulled from a burning vehicle had grown into the girl in the blue dress sitting cross-legged on the hotel carpet, that version had implications he was not ready to look at directly. Not here. Not in this hallway smelling of carpet cleaner and industrial air conditioning, with a radio clipping static on his belt and 40 minutes left on his shift. He pushed off the wall. He finished his circuit. He did his job. At 10:45, he clocked out in the security office on the second floor, changed his jacket, and took the elevator down to the parking structure. He sat in his truck for 11 minutes before starting the engine. The drive home took 22 minutes, and he remembered almost none of it. His sister Donna was asleep on the couch when he got in, which was the arrangement on the nights Mason worked late. She lived 4 blocks away and had a key and a standing offer that she'd repeated so many times it had stopped feeling like charity and started feeling like just the way things were. Declan was in his room. Mason checked on him the way he always did, standing in the doorway long enough to see the small chest rising and falling under the blankets. The soccer cleats knocked sideways at the foot of the bed, the glow of the nightlight casting everything in pale orange. He went to the kitchen. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink. He sat at the table until Donna found him there at midnight, still in his work clothes, the glass untouched. "You look like somebody told you bad news," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter. "Not exactly." "What then?" He didn't answer right away, which with Mason meant he was trying to figure out whether the thing was sayable. Donna knew this about him the way she knew most things about him, through years of watching, through the patience that came from being the older sibling of someone who'd spent his whole life running toward the kinds of situations most people spent their whole lives trying to avoid. "Something happened tonight at work," he said. "Somebody get hurt?" "No, a kid wandered away from her mother. I found her in the service corridor." He turned the glass slowly on the table. "I told her the lighthouse story." Donna sat down across from him. She knew the story. She'd heard him tell it to Declan once, early on, during the months after Karen died, when Declan would wake up with nightmares and Mason would sit on the edge of his bed and talk in the dark until his son's breathing slowed. "And?" she said. She talked. Mason looked up. Her mother came to find her, and from what I could tell, the way the mother reacted, this kid hadn't spoken in a long time. Something happened to her, and she talked. "Mason, that's not the part." He set the glass down. "She mentioned something, a detail, about a night she remembered, a road, being scared, and the voice that told her a story." Donna was quiet. "I think it was the same kid," he said, "from Antwerp." The word sat between them on the table like something neither of them wanted to pick up. Donna had known about Antwerp in the loose outline version. The mission that wasn't a mission, the convoy, the accident, the part where he'd come home quieter than usual and stayed that way. She hadn't asked for details, and he hadn't offered them, and they'd both understood that as a reasonable arrangement. "You don't know that," she said carefully. "I don't," he agreed. "Not yet." "Then don't sit here at midnight deciding you know it." He didn't say anything. He turned the glass again. Donna reached across and put her hand over his, briefly, the way she had when they were kids, and he'd done something he couldn't undo. "Go to sleep," she said. "It'll still be whatever it is in the morning." He went to bed. He did not sleep. Celeste did not sleep either, but she was used to that. What she was not used to was lying awake listening to her daughter talk. Not to her. Not yet. That would have been too much, too fast, and she understood that even in the hours when understanding it felt like trying to hold water in her hands. Lila was in her own room down the hall, the door half open the way she preferred it, and the sound drifting through was one-sided. Lila's voice, low and steady, narrating something to her stuffed rabbit, the gray one with the bent ear that had come through the accident without a scratch, when almost everything else had been destroyed. Celeste sat on the edge of her bed and listened and did not move for a long time. The voice was different than she'd remembered. Not worse, fuller, somehow, the way a muscle gets when it's been rested rather than strained. Lila was 6 now, nearly 7, and the voice coming through the half-open door was not the same voice that had asked, "Why is the sky orange?" Mama from the back seat on the drive to soccer practice 2 weeks before everything changed. It was a little lower, a little more careful. A voice that had decided, for reasons of its own, that tonight was the night. Because of a man in a hotel hallway, because of a coin, because of a story about sailors. Celeste pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and told herself to hold it together, which was the instruction she'd been giving herself for 2 years, and which worked approximately 60% of the time. Tonight, it was not working. She thought about calling Dr. Pham, checked the time, 12:43, and put the phone down. She thought about calling her friend Renata, who was the only person outside of the medical team who knew the full scope of what the last 2 years had looked like. Put the phone down again. She pulled up the event staff roster on her tablet instead. The Langham's event security contract was managed through a company called Paramount Protection Group. She'd worked with their director before, a former police sergeant named Gerald Watts, who ran a tight operation and had never given her a reason to doubt it. She found his direct number in her contacts, looked at the time again, and sent a text instead of calling. Gerald, Celeste Vaughn. I know it's late. I need to ask you about one of your staff tonight, the security officer assigned to the service corridor near the main stage. I'd like his name and contact information if you're able to share it. Important reason? Nothing negative. I'll explain when I can. She set the phone on the nightstand. Down the hall, Lila was still talking. Celeste lay back on the bed, fully clothed, and listened to her daughter's voice fill the apartment the way it used to, ordinary and continuous and real, and cried silently into the dark for a long time, not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a door closed against something enormous and has just, without warning, been allowed to put it down. Gerald texted back at 7:12 the following morning. His name is Mason Ryder. I'll send his number. Good man. Worked with us about 4 months. You need anything else? Call me. She stared at the name. Something moved in the back of her mind. Not a memory. Something adjacent to one. The shape of a name in a document she hadn't read fully. A report she'd been given 2 years ago by the private investigator. She'd hired 6 weeks after the accident, when the police inquiry had stalled and the insurance investigation had returned inconclusive findings, and Celeste had decided that if she wanted to know what actually happened on that highway, she was going to have to find out herself. She went to the study. Third drawer of the filing cabinet, the locked one. She had the key on her keychain because she carried it everywhere, the way you carry the things you aren't finished with. The report was 47 pages. She'd read it through twice in the first month after receiving it and then put it in the drawer because reading it a third time had started doing something to her that Dr. Pham had gently and firmly described as counterproductive. She flipped to page 19 now, the section titled Additional Witnesses and First Responders, Unverified. She found it on the third paragraph of page 21. Subject identified only as American male, military background, approximately mid-30s, by Belgian Federal Police Preliminary Report. Not formally interviewed. Departed scene prior to secondary responder arrival. Local witnesses reported subject provided immediate assistance to surviving child passenger, maintaining contact with child for approximately 40 minutes until paramedic arrival. No identification recovered. Investigation ongoing. Likely civilian contractor or attached military personnel. Identity unconfirmed at time of report. Celeste read the paragraph 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number Gerald had sent. Mason was in the middle of making Declan's lunch when the unknown number called. He almost didn't pick up. He had a rule about unknown numbers, a holdover from years of operational security that he'd never fully been able to shake. But something made him set down the bread knife and answer. Mason Ryder. Mr. Ryder. The voice was composed, precise, the voice of someone who had made difficult calls before and knew how to begin them. My name is Celeste Vaughn. My daughter Lila is the girl you found in the hallway last night at the Langham. A pause. I remember, he said. I got your number from Gerald Watts. I hope that's all right. It's all right. Another pause. He could hear her deciding something on the other end. I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it directly, because I don't have the patience right now for anything else. Okay. 3 years ago, she said. A highway outside of Antwerp, an SUV fire, a child. Mason stopped moving. The kitchen was very quiet. From the back of the apartment, he could hear Declan playing something on his tablet, a tinny video game soundtrack leaking under the door. Were you there? Celeste asked. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the kitchen looked the same as before. The bread on the counter, the half-made sandwich, the morning light coming through the window over the sink. Everything exactly where it had been. Yes, he said. The silence on her end was different now, heavier. She remembered your voice, Celeste said. She couldn't have known. She was 3 years old and it was dark and She stopped, started again. She remembered the story. She said it was the same voice. I know. He sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. I realized it last night, when she mentioned the road. Why didn't you say anything? It was a fair question. He'd been asking it himself since midnight. I wasn't sure, he said. And even if I was sure, that's not a conversation to have in a hotel hallway, not with her mother standing there not knowing who I was. Another silence, this one with a different texture, thinking rather than reacting. I'd like to meet with you, she said. In person. I have questions and I don't want to ask them on the phone. I figured. Are you available this week? Yeah. He rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I can make something work. They agreed on Thursday afternoon, a coffee shop in Lincoln Square that Celeste had chosen, which meant it was probably quiet and discreet and not the kind of place where someone would recognize her and interrupt them. He found out later he was right about all three. He told Donna about the call. She listened without interrupting, which for Donna required visible effort. So it is the same kid, she said when he finished. Seems like it. And the mother found you. Yes. Donna was quiet for a moment, working through something. She had a way of being quiet that was nothing like Mason's. Hers was active. You could almost hear it. And he'd learned years ago to just wait it out. What happened on that road, she asked. The full version, not the one you've been carrying around by yourself. He'd known this was coming. He thought about it for a minute, not about whether to tell her, but about where to start, because the story had edges that were still sharp enough to cut if he handled it wrong. I was on a personal security contract, he said, post-retirement. There was a diplomat, low-level, traveling with his family. Private vehicle, Belgian security detail, one additional contractor, me. We were 40 minutes outside of Antwerp when another vehicle forced us off the road. Forced you off, ran us into the guardrail at speed, deliberate. The lead vehicle went down an embankment and caught fire. He paused. There was a family in the second car. Not the diplomat's family. Civilians who'd been caught in the same lane. A man, a woman, and a child. The man, the father. He got the door open before the fire spread and he got the child out. Handed her to me. Mason stopped again. The bread knife was still on the counter. He looked at it. Then he went back in. I don't know if he was going for the woman or for something else. I don't know if he made it to her. The tank went up about 40 seconds later. Donna's hand came up to cover her mouth briefly. She put it back down. I had the little girl, Mason said. She'd seen enough. She was screaming and then she stopped screaming, which was worse. So I carried her away from the vehicle and I sat down on the road with her and I told her the story. Just to give her something else to listen to. Just to put something between her and the sound of the fire. He exhaled slowly. Belgian federal police arrived about 40 minutes later. Paramedics took the child. I gave a statement to the lead officer and they told me I could go. And you just left? The child was with paramedics. The diplomat situation was being handled. There was nothing else I could do there. He said it the way he said a lot of things. Factually, flatly, like if he didn't give the words any extra weight, they might not hurt. It didn't work. It never had. I found out later the woman survived. Critical injuries, significant recovery. The man didn't, Donna said quietly. No. She was quiet again. Outside, a truck backed up down the street, the reversing beep cutting through the window. You've been carrying this for 3 years, she said, thinking you failed that family. I couldn't save him. Mason, you pulled a 3-year-old out of a burning car. I couldn't save her father. They're not the same thing. I know they're not the same thing, he said, with more edge than he intended. He pulled it back. I know, He handed her to me, Donna. He put his kid in my hands and went back, and I stood there with his daughter and watched the car burn, and then I got in my truck and drove away. He pushed back from the table slightly. So yeah, I've been carrying it. Donna looked at him for a long moment. And now you have to go sit across from his wife on Thursday. Yes. And his daughter, the one who remembered your voice. Just the wife for now. She nodded slowly. Then she said, you know this isn't going to be the kind of meeting where you drink your coffee and answer some questions and go home unchanged. I know. You're not going to be able to keep your distance from this. I'm not trying to keep my distance. He stopped, reconsidered. I don't know what I'm trying to do. That's honest, at least. He almost smiled. Not quite. Don't get too excited. Thursday arrived the way difficult days tend to, faster than expected, preceded by 2 nights of poor sleep, and a morning where everything took longer than it should have. Mason dropped Declan at school, sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes doing absolutely nothing, and then drove to Lincoln Square. The coffee shop was called Ardea. It was small and warm and smelled like espresso and wood, the kind of place that had been there for 20 years and intended to be there for 20 more. He arrived 8 minutes early and took a table near the back wall, facing the door, because some habits don't unlearn. Celeste came in 3 minutes early. He recognized her from the night of the gala, though she looked different without the formal dress and the event face she'd been wearing in the ballroom. She was in dark jeans and a gray sweater, hair down instead of up, and she moved through the cafe with the same economy of motion he'd noticed before, someone who didn't waste steps. She spotted him immediately, which told him she'd been watching for him the same way he'd been watching for her. She sat down across from him without preamble. A server appeared and they both ordered without looking at the menu, which told him she'd been here before, and he told him she'd probably looked it up and memorized their options in advance. For a moment they just looked at each other across the small table. 2 people in possession of overlapping pieces of a story neither of them had chosen. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." She folded her hands on the table. He recognized the gesture. Not nervousness, control. A way of managing what her hands wanted to do. "I read the investigator's report again this morning, the section about the unidentified American at the scene." She paused. "I want you to tell me what happened. From the beginning." "All right," he told her. Not the shortened version he'd given Donna, and not the operational version he'd written in the brief statement to the Belgian officer. The real version, the one with the weight still on it. He told her about the convoy, the forced impact, the fire. He told her about the man who'd appeared from the passenger side of the burning vehicle with a child pressed against his chest, who'd handed her to Mason with a look that didn't need words because there wasn't time for words. He told her about sitting on the road in the dark with the little girl, the way she'd gone quiet after screaming, the story he'd told. Celeste listened without interrupting. Her coffee arrived and she didn't touch it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" she said. "The man." Mason thought about it. He was careful. Tall, dark hair. He was wearing a suit jacket. I remember thinking it was the wrong thing to wear for what he was trying to do, but people don't plan for those moments. He paused. He had cuts on his hands already, from the glass. He didn't stop. He just... Mason looked at the table. "He was going back for you." Celeste's breath caught. She let it out slowly. The hands on the table pressed together harder, knuckles going white briefly before she loosened them. "His name was Daniel," she said. "Daniel Ashford." "I know, I found the report after. I looked." "You looked?" 6 weeks after. I needed to know." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know that's... Don't." Her voice was very steady. "Don't apologize for looking. I looked for you for 2 years." She unclasped her hands, reached for her coffee, wrapped both palms around it without drinking. "I needed to know what you saw, whether he..." She stopped, started differently. "The report said he didn't survive, but it didn't say anything else. I needed to know if he suffered, if he was..." Her voice fractured along a single syllable, and she absorbed it and kept going. "If someone was with him." Mason felt the weight of the question like something physical. "I couldn't get back to the vehicle," he said. "The fire was... I had Lila, and I couldn't bring her back toward it. I don't know what happened to him in the last moments." He paused. "But I can tell you what I saw, before, when he handed her to me." He made himself hold eye contact because she deserved that. He wasn't afraid. Whatever he wasn't afraid. I was just doing the thing. That's the only way I know how to say it. He looked at me and he put his daughter in my arms and he went back. That's who he was. Celeste pressed her lips together. She nodded once, short and firm, the way people nod when they're receiving something they knew they needed but hadn't known would hurt this much. "She waited for you," Celeste said after a moment. "I understand that now. Some part of her. I don't know how it works. Dr. Pham would have a better explanation. But some part of her was waiting for the voice to come back, to finish the story. And until it did, she shook her head slightly. She wasn't ready to come back either. Mason didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be an overreach. She asked about you this morning, Celeste said. At breakfast. First thing. She asked me if the man with the coin was going to come back. He looked up. At breakfast? The question came out before he thought about it. Something crossed Celeste's face. Not quite a smile. Something more fragile than that. More surprised at itself. She talked through dinner last night and through her bath. And she talked herself to sleep, talking to her rabbit. And she woke up this morning and talked through breakfast. Her voice went slightly uneven on the last few words. She steadied it. She wants to know if you're going to come back. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about Antwerp and Daniel Ashford going back into the fire and a 3-year-old handed to a stranger on a dark road. He thought about Declan at home and the coin in his pocket and the way the girl had picked it up off the carpet herself, not waiting to be given it, just reaching out and taking it, which was the bravest thing a frightened child could do. He thought about Donna saying, "You're not going to be able to keep your distance from this." "What did you tell her?" he asked. Celeste looked at him steadily. "I told her I was going to ask you." Outside, the street noise of Lincoln Square moved past the windows. A bus. A bicycle bell. Someone laughing at something 2 tables over. The ordinary sound of people having ordinary mornings. Mason picked up his coffee. He drank some of it. "Then tell her yes," he said. He came back on a Saturday. Celeste had suggested it casually, the way you suggest things when you're trying not to make them feel like too much. A Saturday afternoon, nothing formal, just coffee at the house if he was free, Lila had been asking. She'd said it like it was a small thing. They both understood it wasn't a small thing. Mason had said sure, texted her his confirmation that evening, and then spent most of Friday night sitting at the kitchen table staring at a half-finished crossword puzzle he wasn't actually doing. Declan had soccer practice Saturday morning, which meant Mason had 2 hours to stand on the sideline in the cold with the other parents, watching his son chase a ball with the focused, slightly chaotic energy of a kid who hadn't yet decided whether he was actually good at the sport or just enjoyed the running. He was probably the latter, and Mason had decided that was fine. Not everything needed to be something you were built for. On the drive back, Declan ate a granola bar in the back seat and kicked his cleats together rhythmically against the seat in front of him, which he knew drove Mason crazy, and did anyway. "You're doing that thing," Declan said. "What thing?" "The quiet thing, where you're somewhere else." Mason glanced at him in the rearview mirror. 8 years old, dark eyes, Karen's mouth. Entirely too observant for someone who still occasionally put his shirt on inside out. "I've got a thing this afternoon," Mason said. "What kind of thing?" "I'm going to meet somebody, 2 somebodies." He paused. "A woman I met at work last week, and her daughter." Declan considered this with the particular gravity of an 8-year-old processing new information about his parents' social life. "Like a play date?" "Not exactly. But kind of." Mason almost said no and then didn't, because in some stripped-down way, Declan wasn't entirely wrong. "Her daughter is 6, he said instead. "She's been going through a hard time. I helped her out a little, and her mom wanted to say thank you." Declan absorbed this. "Is the daughter nice?" "I think so. I only talked to her for a few minutes." "What's her name?" "Lila." Declan tried the name out silently, his lips moving. Then he went back to kicking his cleats together. Mason took it as approval, or at least non-objection, which at this stage of the conversation was probably the best he was going to get. He dropped Declan at Donna's, because Donna had offered, and because he hadn't been ready to explain to his son why this particular Saturday afternoon errand felt like standing at the edge of something with unclear footing. He drove to Celeste's address in Lincoln Park, a brownstone on a tree-lined street, 3 stories, the kind of building that had been expensive for 60 years and intended to keep being expensive, and sat in his truck for 2 minutes before getting out. The doorbell was answered not by Celeste, but by Lila. She'd clearly been waiting near the door because she opened it approximately 1 second after he pressed the bell, which meant she'd either been standing right there or had sprinted from somewhere close. She was in leggings and a yellow sweatshirt with a paint stain near the collar, her hair in a braid that was already coming loose the same way it had been at the gala, and she was looking up at him with those serious dark eyes that had the same quality they'd had in the hotel hallway, measuring, careful, giving nothing away for free. Then she said, "You came." "I said I would." She considered this for a moment, as if weighing the reliability of people who said they would do things against the empirical evidence of this man currently standing on her doorstep. Then she stepped back from the door and let him in. Celeste appeared from the direction of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, looking slightly flustered in a way that Mason suspected was not her natural setting. "You found it all right," she said. "GPS. Right, come in. I made coffee. I also have tea if you'd rather." "Coffee's fine." Lila had already disappeared down the hallway, and Mason followed Celeste into the kitchen, which was large and warm and had the lived-in quality of a room that was actually used rather than staged. There were drawings on the refrigerator, not the careful, adult-supervised kind, but the free-range variety, animals in improbable colors, a sun with a face, something that might have been a horse or possibly a bear. A mug with a broken handle sat on the counter holding a collection of colored pencils. A library book about ocean animals lay open on the kitchen table, spine cracked, several pages dog-eared. Celeste poured coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and after a moment Lila reappeared in the doorway holding the gray rabbit with the bent ear. "This is Anchor," she said to Mason, holding the rabbit out slightly, not offering it, presenting it. "Hey, Anchor," Mason said. "She named him after your coin," Celeste said quietly. Then to Lila, "You didn't have to drag him out, baby." "He wanted to meet Mason." Lila climbed into the chair across from Mason, settling the rabbit in her lap with the matter-of-fact authority of a child managing a household that included members who happened to be stuffed animals. "Do you still have the coin?" Mason reached into his jacket pocket and set it on the table. Lila reached for it immediately, picked it up, turned it over the same way he had in the hallway. She examined the anchor on the back, the worn text on the perimeter. "The letters are almost gone," she said. 14 years of pocket travel will do that." "What did it say?" "The unit motto." He thought about it. "It's Latin. Roughly translates to the only easy day was yesterday." Lila looked at the coin for another moment, then set it back on the table, precisely in the spot she'd picked it up from. "That's sad," she said. "Most people think it's tough." "It's both," she said, with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who had decided she understood something and was not interested in debate. Mason glanced at Celeste. Celeste was watching her daughter with the expression of someone who was still getting used to something they'd thought they'd lost. Not quite able to believe it without checking, the way you check your pockets for your keys 3 times, even after you've already found them. "She talks a lot now," Celeste said quietly. It wasn't a complaint. It was wonder, barely controlled. "I have things to say," Lila said, without looking up. She'd picked up the library book and was turning pages with one hand, the other still on the rabbit. "I was just waiting." "For what?" Mason asked. She looked at him across the table. The look was very direct, the kind of directness that children have before they learn to soften everything for adult comfort. "For the right person to talk to," she said, as if this were obvious. The kitchen was quiet for a second. The coffee maker made a small sound and went still. Mason picked up his mug. He drank some coffee. Outside, the October wind moved through the brownstone's front trees, and he could hear it through the kitchen window, low and steady, the way weather sounds when you're inside and warm, and the world is doing its own thing out there without requiring anything from you. It was, he thought, a very ordinary Saturday, and it felt like nothing ordinary he had ever experienced. They stayed for 2 hours. Lila showed him her drawings, not all of them, a curated selection presented with the seriousness of an artist managing a portfolio. "This one is good. This one I did fast and it shows. This one is Anchor before he lost his whiskers, which happened because I put him in my backpack too much." She asked him 4 questions about the Navy in rapid succession, didn't wait for full answers before the next one arrived, and when Mason pointed this out, she said she knew, but she wanted to get through all of them while she remembered them. He answered as honestly as he could, adjusting the content but not the tone, because he'd learned with Declan that children could tell when you were softening things into nonsense, and they found it condescending. Lila, he was quickly learning, found almost everything condescending that wasn't delivered straight. When he got up to leave, she walked him to the door. "Will you come back?" she asked. "If you want me to." "I already told you I do." She looked at him with mild impatience. "I'm asking if you want to." He looked down at her for a moment, this small person in the yellow sweatshirt with the paint stain, holding her rabbit and waiting for a real answer, with the patience of someone who had spent 2 years learning that patience was non-negotiable. "Yeah," he said. "I want to." She nodded, satisfied. "Okay." She opened the door for him. "Bring Declan next time. Mom said he plays soccer." He turned to look back at Celeste, who was leaning in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that was somewhere between amusement and apology. "She asked me about him at breakfast," Celeste said. "I mentioned he plays soccer." "I've got a ball," Lila added. "It's pink. He can use it if he doesn't have one." Mason managed not to smile until he'd made it back to his truck. Once there, he let it happen for approximately 4 seconds before putting the vehicle in drive and going to pick up his son. He told Declan about the pink ball on the drive home. Declan was outraged, deeply and genuinely, in the way of an 8-year-old boy for whom sports equipment color carried serious moral weight. "I have my own ball," he said. "I know. My ball is black and white." "I know, Dec. I'm just saying." She was offering to share. It's a nice gesture. Declan subsided into muttering that Mason couldn't quite make out, which was probably for the best. The second visit happened 2 weeks later. Mason brought Declan, who arrived with his own black and white soccer ball, and a very careful expression that was his version of trying to seem casual about something he was actually uncertain about. Lila met him at the door, the same way she'd met Mason, which was to say immediately, and with assessment in her eyes. They looked at each other for a second, 2 children doing the complicated arithmetic of whether this was going to work. "Do you want to see my drawings?" Lila asked. "Sure," Declan said. They disappeared. Mason stood in the hallway and looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at him. "That was fast," she said. "He's a pretty easy kid." "So is she, when she's not deciding whether she trusts you." They went to the kitchen. Celeste put water on for tea. She knew Mason wouldn't drink, but made anyway, because having something to do with your hands helps when you're in the company of someone you're still figuring out. From down the hall came the sounds of a negotiation about something. They couldn't make out the words, just the rhythms of 2 children deciding the terms of an afternoon. "How is she with Dr. Pham?" Mason asked. Celeste sat down across from him. "Better. Pham says it's like a dam broke. She's processing things now she wasn't able to get to before." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Some of it is hard. She's been having more dreams about the accident. Pham says that's actually a good sign. She's revisiting things instead of locking them out. But it means some mornings are rough." Mason nodded. "She asked me about Daniel," Celeste said, "last week, more than she has in a long time. She asked me why he went back into the car." Her voice was even, carefully maintained, the voice of a woman who had learned to talk about hard things without falling through them. "I didn't have a good answer. I told her he was trying to help, which is true, but it's not. It's not the whole thing." "What's the whole thing?" Celeste looked at her tea. "He couldn't do nothing. That was Daniel. Whatever the cost was, he couldn't stand there and do nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "It's the thing I loved most about him. It's also the thing that—" She stopped. "Yeah," Mason said. She looked up. "You know exactly what I mean." "Yes." She studied him for a second. "Is that why you took the security contract, the convoy job?" He turned his mug on the table slowly. "I just retired. Declan was 4. Karen had been sick for about 8 months at that point, and we both knew where it was going, but neither of us was saying it out loud yet." He paused. "I took the contract because it was short-term, and it was work I knew how to do, and it paid enough to matter. And because I couldn't do nothing, as you put it." Celeste was quiet. "Irony is not lost on me," he said. "I wasn't going to say that. It's still true." He set his mug down. "I couldn't save Daniel, and I couldn't save Karen. Not that those are the same. Cancer isn't the kind of thing you can put yourself between and the person. But there's a version of me that spent a long time thinking if I was just better at the job, faster, smarter, then nobody around me would—" He stopped, shook his head slightly. "Declan calls it the quiet thing, when I'm somewhere else. He called me on it last week, actually, which is either impressive self-awareness for an 8-year-old or evidence I'm being too obvious about it. Probably both, Celeste said. He muttered a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. From down the hall came a burst of laughter. Lila's, high and clear, followed by Declan's, lower, surprised out of him. And both Mason and Celeste turned toward the sound without thinking, the automatic parental reflex of locating your child in the acoustic landscape of a house. When Mason turned back, Celeste was already looking at him. "I haven't heard her laugh like that since before," she said. He didn't ask before what. He knew. 3 more visits happened before Mason started to understand that something was shifting in ways he hadn't prepared for. The visits had a rhythm now. Saturdays usually, sometimes a Sunday afternoon, the kids in the living room or the backyard. If the weather held, him and Celeste at the kitchen table talking the way adults talk when they've run out of the obligatory surface material and have started going deeper without entirely meaning to. He learned that she'd started Ashford Partners from a single acquisition loan she'd taken out at 25, against the advice of 3 separate people who told her the deal would fail, and that it hadn't failed, and that she'd spent the next 5 years acquiring and restructuring with the methodical intensity of someone who had something to prove and was not in the habit of stopping once she'd started. He learned that she'd met Daniel at a business conference in New York when she was 27, that he'd spilled coffee on her conference agenda and apologized for 6 minutes straight, and that she'd agreed to have dinner with him because she respected anyone who could commit to an apology that thoroughly. She learned that Mason had grown up in Rockford, 2 hours south, that he'd enlisted at 18 because Rockford in the late 90s didn't have much to offer a kid who was built for movement and structure and challenge, and that the Navy had given him all 3 and taken a fair amount in return. She learned about Karen, not the whole thing. The whole thing was still in rooms Mason wasn't ready to open, but enough. That she'd been a high school English teacher, that she'd been funny in the way that snuck up on you, that she'd known when he enlisted what kind of man she was agreeing to love and had loved him anyway, which he'd never fully understood and had always been grateful for. He learned about the grief that followed Daniel's death, which had a specific texture distinct from ordinary loss because it came wrapped in terror and guilt, and the particular anguish of a woman who had sent her husband and daughter to that event and had not been there herself. He learned that Celeste had spent 6 months after the accident unable to sleep in the master bedroom and had converted it into a home office and slept in the guest room and had told exactly one person about this, and that person was Renata. She learned about Antwerp, the full version, because one evening when Declan and Lila were doing homework at the kitchen table and Mason and Celeste were on the back porch with their coats on and their coffee going cold, she asked him to tell her again. Not because she hadn't heard it the first time, because she needed to hear it more than once. He understood this. He told it again, with the same weight, without softening anything, and she listened the same way. At the end, she said, You held her for 40 minutes. Yeah. In the dark. On the road. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The porch light was on and moths were doing their moth business around it, and somewhere in the neighbor's yard a dog was working through a complaint about something. Thank you, she said. Not the way she'd said it in the hotel hallway, which had been reflex gratitude in the first seconds of relief. This was different, more deliberate. She'd had weeks to decide she meant it. You've said that, he said. I'm saying it again. She looked at him. I know you've been blaming yourself for Daniel. I know you think... She paused, finding the right words. I know you think that being there and not being able to save him is somehow worse than not having been there at all. Like you were close enough that it should have been possible, and the gap between possible and what actually happened is something you're responsible for. He didn't answer. You're wrong about that, she said. I want to be clear because I think someone should say it directly to you, and I don't know if anyone has. Donna's come close. Then I'll say it all the way. You didn't fail him. You were one person in a situation that was already in motion before you arrived. What you could do, you did. You kept his daughter alive and you kept her from being alone in the worst night of her life. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Daniel would have been grateful to you, not because of what you couldn't do, because of what you did. Mason looked at the backyard, at the dark grass and the bare branches of the tree near the fence, at the ordinary nighttime shape of a yard in November. He breathed in cold air. He held it. Let it go. I'm working on believing that, he said. I know, she said. I can tell. November became December. December had a quality of its own. The early dark, the lights going up on the street outside, Lila's school sending home a paper chain project that somehow ended up being a 2-hour collaborative effort involving Mason, Declan, a dried-up glue stick, and Lila's authoritative instructions about which colors could go next to which other colors according to a system only she fully understood. Declan and Lila had settled into each other with the particular ease of children who have decided, without making a production of it, that they are friends. They argued occasionally about the television and about the correct rules of various games, and once at length about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, with Declan citing volume and Lila citing quality. But the arguments had the structure of genuine friendship, the back and forth of people who know they'll still be talking to each other tomorrow. Mason watched his son come home from the Ashford house on a Saturday in early December and sit down at the kitchen table and eat his dinner and talk without stopping, all about something Lila had told him about octopuses, and thought about the 8 months after Karen died when Declan had gone quiet, in ways the grief counselor had called normal, but that had felt, from the inside, like watching a light go dim. He hadn't known how to fix it. He'd sat with it, which was the only thing he'd known to do, and eventually the light had come back on, the way lights do if you give them enough time and enough room. He was thinking about this, sitting at the table after Declan had gone to bed, the kitchen quiet. The paper chain from Lila's project looped over the cabinet knob by the window where Declan had hung it, when his phone rang. Celeste. He picked up. Hey. Hey. Her voice was different, not alarmed, something more internal than that. Lila had a nightmare. The bad kind, the one where she wakes up and it takes her a while to come back. Is she okay? She's okay now. She's in my bed. She's been talking for about 40 minutes, and I think she's almost down. A pause. She asked for you. Mason was quiet. Not in a crisis way, Celeste added quickly. She asked where you were, whether you were far away. I told her you were home with Declan, and she said okay, and then she talked for another 15 minutes about octopuses, because apparently that's been on her mind. Declan started that one. I figured. Another pause, this one with a different weight to it. I'm not calling because I need you to do anything. I thought you should know, she asked. Her voice was quiet. She's been doing better. The nightmares come less, but when they come, they're... She stopped. I know, he said. Dec had them. After Karen. What did you do? He thought about it. Sat with him. Didn't try to talk him out of it. Didn't tell him it wasn't real, because to him it was real. Just stayed there until it passed. Yeah. Celeste exhaled slowly. That's what I did. It's the right thing. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. He turned the coffee mug on the table. But it is. I think it might be the main thing. Celeste was quiet for a moment. In the background, he could hear the soft sound of a child's breathing, and underneath it the ambient sounds of the house, all of it quiet and warm and ordinary. Mason, she said. Yeah. Do you regret it? Coming back. To us. He looked at the paper chain over the cabinet knob. Lila's voice in his head. Red can't go next to orange. That's a rule, Declan. Declan's. Who made that a rule? Lila's. Color theory. No, he said. Not for a second. She breathed out. Good. A pause. I'll let you go. Go to sleep. You too. I'll try. A small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Good night, Mason. Night. He sat in the kitchen for a while after she hung up. The paper chain moved slightly in the draft from somewhere, the colors turning slow in the cabinet light. Red next to yellow, next to blue, in the order Lila had specified and Declan had eventually conceded, because Lila's level of conviction about color theory was difficult to argue against for long. He'd come into this, he understood now, thinking it was something he could manage from a distance. He'd thought he could help, and then step back, the way he'd always been able to step back from things. The trained detachment of someone who'd spent in the field was a liability. He thought he could sit in Celeste's kitchen and drink coffee and answer Lila's questions and then drive home and be the same man he'd been before, just a man who occasionally visited a family that needed some help getting back on its feet. He understood now that he'd been wrong about that, and that being wrong about it did not feel bad. That was the part he hadn't expected. He'd expected it to feel dangerous or complicated, or like a burden he was picking up because he owed a debt that could never really be cleared. He'd been ready for that version of it. He'd had arguments prepared against himself, good ones, about the risks of getting attached, about Declan, about the fact that Celeste Vaughn lived in a Lincoln Park brownstone and ran a 7-company portfolio and existed in a world that was in almost no practical sense adjacent to his. What he hadn't been ready for was for it to feel like the most solid ground he'd stood on in 3 years. He got up, rinsed his mug, turned off the kitchen light. Checked on Declan. Still the small chest rising and falling, the cleats by the bed, the nightlight. And went to his own room and lay in the dark and thought about Antwerp. He still thought about Antwerp. He didn't think that would stop. But he noticed, lying in the dark, that the texture of it had changed. It wasn't a wound anymore. Or it wasn't only a wound. It was also the road that had brought him to a hotel hallway in Chicago, to a little girl in a blue dress, to a coin on a gray carpet, to a woman who said thank you, like she'd been waiting to say it at full volume for 2 years. He'd done a thing he could not undo on that highway. He understood now that the thing he could not undo had 2 sides, and he'd only been looking at one of them. He closed his eyes. He slept. January came in cold and without apology. The kind of Chicago January that doesn't bother pretending, wind off the lake, temperatures that made the morning walk from car to building feel like a negotiation with something hostile. The city going gray and determined, hunkered down into itself the way it did every year when winter stopped being seasonal and started being personal. Mason had grown up 2 hours south and understood Midwestern winter the way you understand anything you've spent your whole life inside of. Not fondly, but without the particular shock of someone who thought it would be different this year. He'd taken a new job in December, one of Donna's connections, a facilities management company that needed someone with a security background to oversee their building access systems and liaise with contracted guard services across their portfolio. Desk work, mostly, which he'd expected to hate and found instead to be tolerable, possibly because it came with regular hours and benefits and the ability to pick up Declan from school 3 days a week without having to negotiate shift coverage with someone half his age. The Saturdays at Celeste's house had continued without either of them making a formal decision that they would. It had simply become the shape of the week. Saturday morning, Mason and Declan, the brownstone on the tree-lined street, Lila at the door before the bell finished ringing, the kitchen, the coffee, the kids migrating through the house like weather systems, loud in one room, mysteriously quiet in another. Dr. Pham had told Celeste in early January that Lila's progress was, clinically speaking, remarkable. She'd used that exact word, and Celeste had written it in the small notebook she kept for appointment notes because she needed to be able to look at it later, when the bad mornings came, and remind herself that the overall direction was real. Lila was speaking at school now, not freely. She still picked her moments, still had days where she came home quieter than others. But she'd answered a question in class, and she'd told her teacher something funny about octopuses that had apparently become a small legend among the second-grade faculty. She'd also started piano. This had not been Celeste's idea. It had been Lila's, announced one Saturday morning in early January as she was eating cereal and watching Mason with the evaluative expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to deploy it. "Do you know how to play piano?" she'd asked. Mason had looked up from his coffee. "A little. Why?" "There's a piano at school. The music teacher showed us the keys. I want to learn." "Then we'll find you lessons," Celeste had said. "Mason could teach me," Lila said. Not as a question. Celeste had looked at Mason. Mason had looked at Lila. Lila had continued eating her cereal with the serenity of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. "I'm not a teacher," Mason said. "You don't have to be a teacher. You just have to know more than me." "Which you do." She tapped her spoon on the edge of the bowl. "You said a little, but your hands are the right shape for it." "What does that mean?" "Long fingers. That's what Mrs. Okafor says. She says long fingers are good for piano." Celeste had covered her mouth with her hand and looked at the window. He started teaching Lila piano on the second Saturday of January. Celeste had an upright in the living room, a Yamaha she'd had since her own childhood, that had survived 4 apartments and a cross-city move and was only slightly out of tune in the upper register. Mason sat beside Lila on the bench and showed her where middle C was, and she pressed it with one finger, very deliberately, and then looked at him like she was waiting for further information. They did this for 40 minutes. He showed her the basic positions, the hand placement, the way you let the weight of your arm do part of the work rather than hammering with just your fingers. She was impatient with the slow parts, which was every part, but she had something he recognized from his own early training, a willingness to repeat the same thing until it stopped being wrong. Not cheerfully. She complained about it in a steady, low-grade monologue that he found, against his expectations, genuinely funny. Declan sat on the armchair across the room for most of the first lesson, theoretically reading a book about dinosaurs, actually watching with the expression of someone trying to appear more bored than they were. "You want to try?" Mason asked at one point. "No," Declan said immediately. "Okay." 10 minutes later, Declan was on the bench on Lila's other side, pressing middle C with one finger the same way she had, and Lila was explaining hand position to him with the authority of someone who had been playing piano for 35 minutes and was therefore the senior practitioner in the room. Mason stood behind them and said nothing. He watched his son's dark head tilted slightly toward the girl beside him, both of them intent on a single piano key, both of them working on something small and specific and real. The afternoon light came through the living room windows at a low angle, the way it does in January, and it fell across the piano keys and the two children and the worn Yamaha finish in a way that didn't ask anything of anyone. He thought quietly that this was one of the better things he'd seen in a long time. What he didn't tell Celeste, what he hadn't told anyone except the VA therapist he'd seen 6 times before, deciding he'd rather work through things on his own, a decision the therapist had disagreed with, and that Mason still wasn't sure was right, was that January was historically a difficult month. Not because of any single thing, it was more cumulative. Karen had been diagnosed in January 3 years ago. She died in the following March, but January was where the shape of it had become unavoidable, where the oncologist had used the words that changed the grammar of everything going forward. And Antwerp had been October, but Mason's dreams didn't follow the calendar. They operated on their own schedule, surfacing when they wanted, and they'd surfaced more than usual this January. Not every night. Maybe twice a week. Always the same basic architecture, the rain, the road, the fire, the man handing him the child. Sometimes in the dreams he made it back to the vehicle in time. Those were the worst ones, because in the dreams he couldn't make himself fast enough, and Daniel died anyway, and the failure happened in slow motion with Mason right there, close enough to touch the roof of the burning car. He'd gotten good at waking himself up. You learn that, over enough years of bad dreams, the technique of recognizing the texture of a nightmare from inside it, and grabbing the edge of wakefulness before the whole thing ran its course. He'd lie in the dark afterward for 10 or 20 minutes, listening to the house, cataloging the ordinary sounds. The furnace cycling, the tree outside Declan's window moving in the wind, the occasional car on the street. Constructing the present tense from its components until it felt solid enough to sleep in again. He hadn't told Celeste because there was no good reason to, and several good reasons not to, the main one being that she was carrying enough of her own weight without needing to know the specifics of his nocturnal architecture. He told her anyway, on a Tuesday in mid-January, because she asked. It had been a phone call. They talked on the phone now, not just when something was wrong, sometimes just in the evenings after the kids were in bed. Conversations that moved in the loosely connected way of two people who have gotten comfortable enough to follow a thread wherever it goes. She'd been telling him about a difficult board meeting, a shareholder who'd been pushing for a restructuring she didn't agree with, and he'd been half listening in the way that was actually listening, the way where you're not formulating a response but just receiving. And then there had been a pause and she'd asked if he was tired. "Little bit," he'd said. "Bad week?" He'd thought about his standard answer, which was some variant of, "I'm fine," deployed with enough evenness to close the topic. He didn't use it. "Dreams," he said instead. "January's usually a rough month." She'd been quiet for a moment. Then, "About Karen?" "About Antwerp mostly. Karen too sometimes. They're different." He paused. "The Karen ones are sad. The Antwerp ones are operational, like I'm still trying to fix it." "In the dreams, can you?" "No. That's the thing about them. I'm always right there, and I can never—" He stopped. Started differently. "It's not about Lila in the dreams. I want to be clear about that. Lila is out of the car in the dreams. She's okay. It's just, Daniel." "Yeah." Celeste was quiet. He could hear her breathing, slow and even. I have them too, she said. Not as often as I used to, but I have one where I'm there, where I'm in the car somehow, and I can see him, and I can't. She stopped. I can't reach him. Mason didn't say anything. Some things don't benefit from a response. I've never told anyone that, she said. Not exactly in those words. It stays there, he said. That specific version of it. Yeah. A pause. It does. They stayed on the phone for another hour after that, talking about things that were lighter, because sometimes after you say the true hard thing, you need to talk about what Declan said at dinner and whether Lila's piano was progressing and what Celeste's attorney had to say about the shareholder dispute, and all of that is part of the same conversation, the one that doesn't have a fixed topic but keeps returning to the same center. He didn't tell her he was falling in love with her. He wasn't ready to say that out loud, not because he didn't understand what it was. He'd been in love before. He knew the shape of it, the way it changed the quality of ordinary things. But because it came with complications, he was still working through. She was Lila's mother. She was Daniel's widow. She existed in a world of acquisition deals and board meetings and charity galas, and he worked facilities security and drove a truck that needed new rear brakes and ate cereal for dinner more often than he'd want to admit. He thought about all of this in the evenings after they got off the phone. He thought about it and came, each time, to the same conclusion, that none of the complications were reasons, they were just facts. Facts required navigation, not avoidance. He was still working on the navigation. The rupture, when it came, arrived from a direction he hadn't been watching. It was a Sunday in late January, one of the unplanned visits. Lila had called Declan on the family tablet to ask about a homework question involving fractions, and this had somehow, through a logic Mason had stopped trying to follow, turned into a plan for both families to have lunch at the brownstone. He'd picked up groceries on the way. Celeste had told him not to. He'd done it anyway, because showing up empty-handed to someone's house felt wrong, regardless of the context. And he was in the kitchen making grilled cheese while the kids did fractions at the table, and Celeste stood at the counter reviewing something on her laptop, and it was ordinary and warm and completely comfortable, which was the state of things now, comfortable, which was its own kind of remarkable. Then Celeste went still. He noticed it the way he noticed most things, the change in the peripheral, the stillness that didn't fit the rhythm of the room. She was looking at her laptop screen with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not alarmed exactly, something more controlled than that. The expression of someone who has just read something they need to process before they can react. What? He said. She looked up, glanced at the kids who were arguing about whether you needed a common denominator to multiply fractions, which you don't, but Lila had a theory about it. I need to show you something, Celeste said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. When you have a minute. He flipped the sandwiches. 2 minutes. She waited. He plated the sandwiches, told the kids lunch was ready, watched them settle into it with the automatic focus of children presented with food, and then followed Celeste the few feet into the dining room where she turned the laptop to face him. It was an email. From an address he didn't recognize, a string of numbers and letters that suggested an anonymized account. The subject line was blank. The body was 4 sentences. You've been spending time with Mason Ryder. You should know who he really is. The convoy he was protecting the night your husband died wasn't a civilian diplomatic convoy. Look up Operation Callaway, Belgian Federal Archives, October 2021. Then ask him what he was actually doing there. Mason read it twice. Celeste was watching his face. Who sent this? He said. I don't know. The account is fake. My IT person confirmed it came through a relay. She paused. It arrived this morning. I almost didn't open it. He straightened up. The kitchen sounds were right there. The kids talking, the scrape of a chair, Declan saying something about soccer practice tomorrow. All of it 10 feet away and a different world entirely. Operation Callaway, Celeste said. Her voice was measured, deliberate. The voice of someone who wants the truth and is managing their anxiety about what it might be. Do I need to look that up, or can you tell me? He looked at her. He could have handled it badly. He'd thought, at moments over the past months, about what he would do if the full context of Antwerp ever came up. Not because he'd been hiding it exactly, but because there were layers to it that he hadn't volunteered, partly because they weren't his to give, and partly because they didn't change the essential fact of what happened, and he hadn't seen the point in adding weight to an already heavy story. He understood now that he'd been wrong about that, the same way he'd been wrong about being able to keep his distance. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Callaway was a sanctioned operation, he said. Not military. The company I was contracted through had an arrangement with a Belgian intelligence unit. The convoy wasn't just a diplomat. There was an intelligence asset being extracted, someone who'd been working inside a criminal network operating out of Antwerp. The diplomat was cover. Celeste sat down slowly. I was hired as additional physical security because the company's regular contractors were already deployed elsewhere and the timeline on the extraction moved up. I was told the risk level was managed. He looked at the table. It wasn't managed. What does that mean? The criminal network had eyes on the convoy. The forced accident wasn't random. They were trying to stop the extraction. He looked up at her. Your husband and your family were not the target. You were in the wrong place, wrong road, wrong time, wrong moment. The vehicle that hit the convoy clipped the SUV carrying the asset and pushed it into your car. The room was quiet. So Daniel died, Celeste said, and her voice was very even, terrifyingly even, the evenness of someone holding something in by force, because an intelligence operation went wrong. Yes, and you knew this. I knew what I was contracted for. I knew the asset. I knew the network. I knew the risk profile that turned out to be wrong. He kept his eyes on her face. I did not know there would be a civilian vehicle in that lane. I did not know what was about to happen to your family. And I did not know, when Daniel handed me Lila and went back into that car, that the reason the accident happened was connected to work I had been part of. She absorbed this. When did you put it together? She said. That night, after it was over. When I gave my statement to the federal officers, the picture came together. He folded his hands on the table. I've asked myself every day since whether I should have found you, whether I owed you that explanation. His jaw tightened. I didn't find you. I told myself it was because revealing the operational context could have created legal complications, could have exposed the asset, could have caused more damage. Those things were true. They were also... He stopped. Started again. They were also convenient reasons to not have to look at what I'd been part of. Celeste stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and he could see her reflection in the dark glass, and her face was doing the thing he'd only seen it do once before, in the hotel hallway, the thing where all the control she was so good at slipped its moorings. My husband, she said, stopped. My husband died in an accident that wasn't an accident. Yes. And the people responsible were the criminal network. The network has since been dismantled. That's a matter of Belgian federal record. Public, you can find it. The extraction succeeded. The asset's testimony was used in the prosecution. He said it without softening it, because she deserved the whole thing. I don't think that information is supposed to make you feel better. I'm just telling you what happened. She turned around. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. The expression on her face was one he hadn't seen before and couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't anger, or not only anger, it was something larger and less specific, the expression of a person recalibrating a story they thought they understood. Why didn't you tell me, she said. When we met at the coffee shop. When I asked you what happened. Because I told you what I knew that was mine to tell. The operational details are mine to know, she said. Because it was my husband. He didn't argue with that. She was right. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen noise was still there. The kids, the ordinary sounds of a Sunday lunch, the entirely separate world of two children who knew nothing about Belgian criminal networks or intelligence assets, or the machinery of events that had reshaped all their lives. I need you to go, she said. His chest did something that wasn't quite pain, but was in the same county. Okay. Not because I've decided anything. I need tonight to think. She rubbed her hand across her forehead. I have more questions and I can't ask them right now because the kids are 10 feet away and I can't... Her voice fractured along the edge of the word and she caught it. I just need tonight. I understand. He stood up. I'm sorry. I should have told you everything from the beginning. The reasons I had for not doing that were real, and they were also not good enough. She nodded. One short, hard nod. He went back to the kitchen. He told Declan they had to get going, deployed the easy parental lie about an errand, absorbed Declan's protest with practiced patience, and got their coats. Lila looked at him with the careful dark eyes that missed nothing and said, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said. "I'll see you Saturday." She looked at him for another second, and he thought she was going to push on it the way she pushed on things, with her particular 6-year-old refusal to accept a non-answer. But she just said, "Okay," and held up anchor in a small wave. He drove home. He put Declan to bed. He sat in the kitchen. He did not drink the whiskey. Celeste called him 3 days later. 3 days during which Mason had gone to work, picked up Declan, cooked dinner, answered a text from Donna, who had somehow intuited that something was wrong, she always did, gone to bed, woken from the Antwerp dream twice, and done his level best not to make any decisions in either direction while she was thinking, because she'd asked for time and he owed her that without any interference. When his phone rang at 9:15 on Wednesday night, he picked up before the second ring. "I talked to my attorney," she said, without preamble, "and I made some calls to Belgium, not to reopen anything, just to understand the full picture." "Okay." "The network prosecution is real. The timeline tracks." A pause. "My investigator missed it because the operational connection was classified and he didn't have the access to find it." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "I've been angry," she said, "these 3 days. Not at you specifically, or at you specifically, but at the whole shape of it. That Daniel went back into that car because of something he had nothing to do with, because of a criminal organization and an intelligence extraction that had zero connection to our lives." She paused. "It's a different kind of grief, knowing it was preventable, knowing the specific mechanism." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry you have that now. I was going to have it eventually. Better from you than from an anonymous email with an agenda." "I don't know." She took a breath. "Who do you think sent it?" "I've been thinking about that. Someone who knows both my history and yours, who knew I was spending time with you, who wanted to create damage." He paused. "I don't know who. I have some ideas about what category of person it might be. I'll look into it. I'd like to be told what you find." "Of course." Another pause. He listened to the quiet on her end of the line and tried to read it. "I'm not asking you to stop coming," she said. "That's the main thing I needed to say. I thought about it. I went back and forth on it." Her voice was tired in a particular way, the tiredness of someone who has spent 3 days wrestling with something and reached the end of their strength. "And I kept coming back to the same place." "Which is?" "That you held my daughter on a dark road for 40 minutes because her father asked you to, and that everything else, the operational context, the things you didn't tell me, are real, and I'm still angry about parts of it." She paused. "But they're not the main thing, and I don't want to make the mistake of letting the parts I'm angry about crowd out the main thing." He let out a breath he hadn't entirely known he was holding. "Lila asked about you every day," she said. "She didn't push. She just... Every morning she asked when Saturday was. And I didn't know how to explain that some things between adults get complicated without it becoming about her." "It's not about her," he said. "The complicated parts, those are mine and yours to work through." "Yes." She was quiet. "There's a lot I still want to say to you, in person." "I know." "Friday?" she said. "After the kids are in bed, just us." "I'll be there." She said goodnight. He said goodnight. He sat in the kitchen for a while after, not doing anything, just being in the room with the heat on and the tree outside tapping the window the way it always did in the wind. The paper chain was still over the cabinet knob. He'd told Declan they should take it down. Declan had said it should stay until Lila saw it again, with a logic that was difficult to argue with, so they'd left it. He looked at it for a moment. Red next to yellow, next to blue, in the order Lila had specified, because color theory was a rule, and rules existed for reasons even if the reasons weren't always explained. Friday would be hard. The conversation would have rough parts. He'd have to sit across from her and answer questions he'd hoped he wouldn't have to answer, and some of her anger would come across the table at him, and he'd have to take it, because it was earned. He was not afraid of that. He'd been afraid of it for weeks, in the background, the low hum of a thing you're hoping won't arrive. Now that it was arriving, he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was just ready. He was tired of managing the distance between what he wanted to say and what he'd been saying, and Friday would be the end of that particular distance. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. The dream came anyway, the highway, the fire, Daniel going back. But this time when Mason woke himself up and lay in the dark, cataloging the sounds of the house, he noticed that the quality of the silence was different. It was just silence, not empty. Not the silence of a man lying in the dark alone with his failures, just the ordinary silence of a house, doing what houses do, holding everything inside it the same as always, patient and solid and there. He lay in it. He let it be enough. In 4 days, he would sit across from Celeste Vaughn in her living room and tell her the full truth of everything he hadn't said, and she would tell him things she'd been holding, and they would sit together in the difficult space between what had happened and what came next, and they would stay in it until it became something they could both live in. He was sure of that in the way he was rarely sure of things. Not the certainty of someone who knows the outcome, but the certainty of someone who has decided, finally and without reservation, that the outcome is worth every hard thing it takes to reach. Friday arrived the way important things tend to, quietly, without announcement, dressed in the same clothes as an ordinary day. Mason dropped Declan at Donna's after school, told her he'd be late, and accepted the look she gave him without comment. Donna had a gift for communicating entire paragraphs through a single expression, and this one said something like, "I know what tonight is, and I hope you don't mess it up," without requiring any of those words out loud. He drove to Lincoln Park in the early dark of a February evening. The city lit up against a sky the color of old pewter, and he sat in the truck in front of the brownstone for 3 minutes before getting out. Not because he was afraid. He'd already been through afraid and come out the other side of it. He sat there because he wanted to remember the before of this. The version of himself that still had the conversation ahead of him, still had the chance to say the things that needed saying, before it became the after. Then he got out and rang the bell. Celeste answered the door herself this time. She was in dark jeans and a loose sweater the color of charcoal, hair down, no event face, no composure armor. She looked like herself, which he'd come to understand was one of the things he valued most about the version of her that existed in this house. Away from the board meetings and the galas, the version that drank her coffee standing at the counter and got paint on her sweater sleeve from helping Lila and left library books open face down even though you weren't supposed to. "Kids are down," she said. "Already?" "I may have accelerated bedtime slightly." She stepped back to let him in. Lila negotiated an extra story, and Declan, she calls him on the tablet most evenings now. Did I tell you that? He mentioned it. Said she corrects his fractions. She corrects everyone's fractions. Celeste almost smiled. Almost. The weight of the evening was still on her, but it was a different weight than 3 days ago. Not the raw, disoriented anger of someone who'd just had a story rewritten on them, but the weight of someone who had worked through something and arrived at the place where the real conversation could happen. They went to the living room. She'd left the main light off and the floor lamp in the corner on, which gave the room the quality of late evening without being dark. And there was tea on the coffee table that she'd made, and that they both knew Mason wouldn't drink, but that gave her something to do with her hands. He sat on the couch. She sat in the armchair across from him, drew her feet up, wrapped her hands around her mug. They looked at each other across the coffee table. "I want to go first," she said. "Okay." She took a breath. "I've been angry, and I told you that on the phone, and I'm not going to pretend I'm done being angry, because I'm not. I think I'll be angry about parts of this for a long time. The operational context, the classified machinery that put my husband's car on that road. I've been sitting with that, and it's..." She shook her head slightly. "It's a different shape of grief than the one I was carrying before. I don't know yet if it's heavier or just differently heavy." "That's honest," he said. "I want to be honest. That's the thing. These 3 days, I kept coming back to that, to the fact that I have spent 2 years surrounded by people who love me, being very careful with what they say to me. Renata, my mother, Dr. Pham, they're all careful with me. Measured. They give me information in the dose they think I can handle." She looked at him. "You told me things nobody else would have told me, in the coffee shop, on the phone. The full version, when you could have given me the soft version and I wouldn't have known the difference." "You would have known," he said. "Eventually, yes." She turned the mug in her hands. "You didn't wait for eventually. That's not a small thing to me." He nodded. "And then I found out there was more," she said. "The operational context. That there was a layer you hadn't given me. She paused. But I've been trying to be fair to myself about this, because I think when we're hurt, we're not always fair. The layer you hadn't given me wasn't yours to give freely. It was classified. It involved other people. It had legal dimensions. I can be angry that you didn't find a way to tell me anyway, and I can also acknowledge that the situation was more complicated than man has information, man withholds information. Both of those things are true. They are, he said. The complication was real. And it was also convenient. I want to own that part. She looked at him for a moment. What do you mean? I mean the reasons I had for not telling you were real, and I leaned on them harder than I needed to because telling you meant sitting in front of Daniel's wife and saying that the night he died was connected to work I was part of. And that was, he stopped, found the words. That was harder than the other version, the version where I was just a stranger on a road who tried to help. You were never just a stranger on a road, she said quietly. I know that now. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm sorry, Celeste. Not a general sorry. A specific one. You deserve the full picture from the first conversation, legal complications or not. You deserve to make your own decisions about it with complete information. I made that choice for you by not giving it to you, and I was wrong. The room was quiet. She sat with it for a moment, and he could see her receiving it, not letting him off the hook, not dismissing it, actually taking it in the way an apology is supposed to be taken when it's real. Okay, she said. Not, it's fine. Not, don't worry about it. Just, okay. The acknowledgement of someone who has been apologized to genuinely and is deciding to accept it without making it disappear. Okay. He sat back. They were both quiet for a moment. There's something else, he said. She waited. I've been trying to figure out who sent that email. The anonymous one. He looked at the coffee table. I have a former contact, someone I worked with in the years after my retirement, in the private security world. He's been in touch with the right people, and the picture that's coming back is someone who doesn't want me in your orbit. Someone with a reason to want you isolated, or specifically to want you distrustful of people who aren't already in your world. Celeste's expression shifted. The shareholder. His name is Reinhard Bauer, Mason said. He's on the board of one of your companies, Ashford Industrial. Your attorney mentioned him the week before the email arrived, the restructuring proposal you rejected. I rejected it because it would have meant laying off 400 people to increase a margin I don't need to increase. Her voice had gone flat in a different way. The professional flatness of a woman who had spent years navigating rooms full of men who thought they could outmaneuver her. He's been building a block among the minority shareholders for 3 months. The email was designed to make you question your judgment, Mason said, to make you doubt someone you'd let get close. If you pulled back from me, you'd be more isolated, less stable, and in Bauer's read, more vulnerable to pressure at the board level. He paused. I don't know if that's cynical enough to be true or too cynical to be true. No, she said. That's exactly cynical enough. She put her mug down. He underestimated me. He did. She looked at Mason steadily. He also underestimated you. Something in him settled. Not the full weight. The full weight was going to take longer. The accountability he carried about Antwerp was not the kind of thing one honest conversation absolved. But something settled. The specific tension of the last 3 days releasing its grip by a degree that mattered. My attorney is already on the shareholder issue, she said. It'll be handled. She said it the way she said most things about her business. Not arrogantly, just with the confidence of someone who had been handling things for a long time and knew the difference between a real problem and a man who thought he could push her. Then she was quiet, and the quiet had a different texture than the silences earlier in the evening, looser, less loaded. Can I say something else? He said. Yes. He looked at her. He'd been working out how to say this for weeks, going back and forth on the phrasing, and he'd finally concluded that there was no version of it that wasn't direct, so it might as well be direct. I don't know exactly when it happened, probably around the time your daughter told me my fingers were the right shape for piano, and I couldn't argue with the logic. He paused. I'm in love with you. I want you to know that before anything else gets decided, because I'm done managing the distance between what's true and what I'm saying. Celeste looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment, and he sat in the moment without trying to fill it, which was one of the harder things he'd learned in his life. That some silences were working silences, not empty ones, and filling them was just a way of making yourself more comfortable at the expense of the other person. I know, she said finally. You know. I've known for a while. She wasn't smiling, not quite. I was waiting for you to say it. How long were you going to wait? I hadn't set a deadline. Now the almost smile arrived, and it was a real one, tired around the edges the way real smiles are when they come at the end of a hard week, but real. I figured eventually you'd get there. He made a sound that was, against all probability given the weight of the evening, an actual laugh, short and surprised. You could have said something. It wasn't mine to say first. You had more to work through. She looked at him, and the smile faded into something quieter and more serious. I'm not in the same place. I want to be clear about that. I'm not. She paused. There are things I'm still working through about Daniel, about the grief, about what it means to be in a different place than I was. That's not simple, and it's not finished. I know. And this is complicated. Our history, the kids, the distance between our lives in the practical sense. I know all of that. I'm not saying it to push you away. I'm saying it because I need you to know that I'm going into this, if we're going into this, with my eyes open. I've done enough not seeing clearly in the last 2 years to last me a long time. What are you saying? He asked. Not impatiently. He just wanted to hear her say it. She looked at him across the coffee table, in the warm corner lamplight of her living room, in the house where her daughter had started talking again, and learned the location of Middle C and named her rabbit after an anchor. And she said, I'm saying I'm not asking you to go anywhere. He nodded, slow, once. Okay, he said. She reached forward and picked up her mug. He picked up the tea he hadn't touched. They sat in the room together with the evening settling around them. And it was not the resolution of everything. Too many things were still in motion. Too many things were still tender and unfinished. But it was the resolution of enough. It was the place where the ground became solid enough to build on, which is all anyone ever actually needs. March came in with the specific optimism of Chicago deciding, after months of stubborn winter, that spring might be permitted after all. The temperature crept up in increments. The light came back by degrees, and Lila started second grade with a yellow backpack and a prepared speech for her teacher about octopus cognition that her teacher later described to Celeste as the most thoroughly researched, unsolicited presentation she'd received in 12 years of teaching. She was talking to everyone now. Not all the time. She had her quiet days, the ones where something was sitting on her, and she needed to process it internally before she could share it. And Dr. Pham said that was fine. That was just Lila's nature. Not every personality needs to externalize everything to be healthy. But on the days she talked with the unselfconscious ease of a child who had decided that having things to say was not a liability, but a fact, and that facts were meant to be stated. She'd had one more bad nightmare in February, the third week, and she'd woken Celeste at 2 a.m, and they'd sat together in the kitchen drinking warm milk. Celeste the same as Lila, because it felt wrong to just sit there not drinking anything. And Lila had told her, haltingly, about the dream. The road. The fire. The part she remembered. Celeste had listened without interrupting and without managing her own face too hard, because Lila watched faces and could tell when an adult was performing composure rather than actually sitting with her. Do you think about Daddy? Lila had asked. Every day, Celeste said. Is that sad? Celeste thought about it. She gave Lila the honest answer, the one Dr. Pham had been guiding her toward for months, the one that was true without being more than a 7-year-old needed to carry. Sometimes it's sad. Sometimes it just feels like carrying him, like he's still here but in a different way. Lila had thought about this for a moment, both hands around her warm milk mug, anchor tucked under one arm. Like how he went back, she said. Celeste had gone still. He went back because that's who he was, Lila said. Right? You told me that. Yes. So that part of him is still here, because it's what he did. She looked up at her mother with the dark eyes that had Daniel's seriousness in them, his way of sitting with a question until he was sure of the answer. Mason stayed too, on the road. He stayed with me. He did, Celeste said. So maybe that's what people are, Lila said, with the particular confidence of a child who has reasoned her way to something and is reporting her findings. What they do when it's hard. That's the part that stays. Celeste had not been able to speak for a moment. She'd pressed her lips together and breathed through it, and then said, "I think you might be right about that." Lila had finished her milk and gone back to bed and slept without waking, and Celeste had sat at the kitchen table for another hour. Not because she was sad, or not only because she was sad, but because her 7-year-old had just told her something true about the nature of people that she was going to spend the rest of her life thinking about. She told Mason about it the next day. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's something," he said. "She is." "Declan told me last week that she's his best friend." He shook his head slightly. "He's never said that about anyone. He said it like it was obvious." She said the same thing about him, in those exact words. "He's my best friend." And then she went back to explaining something about shark anatomy. They were at the kitchen table, where they were most of the time now. The paper chain had been replaced. Lila and Declan had made a new one in March, longer, more colors, with a rule system of staggering complexity that Mason had written down on a piece of paper at Lila's insistence so they wouldn't forget it. It looped twice around the cabinet and had been declared permanent. The idea for the foundation came from a conversation that was not, on its surface, about a foundation. It was an April evening, and Mason had mentioned, offhandedly, something he'd been turning over for weeks. A conversation he'd had with the counselor at Declan's school about a boy in Declan's class who'd witnessed a violent incident in his home and had gone quiet in the way Declan had recognized and reported to Mason with the seriousness of a child delivering important intelligence. "He doesn't talk the way he used to, Dad. It's the quiet thing." Mason had gone in to talk to the school counselor, a well-meaning woman who was stretched across too many students and too little training for trauma-specific intervention, and the conversation had left him with the familiar low-grade frustration of someone who could see a gap and couldn't do anything about it. "The resources aren't there," he said. "Not in public schools, not in the price range most families can access. The kids who need the most specific help are the ones in systems that can offer them the most general help. That's the gap." Celeste had been listening with the particular quality of attention she had when something was landing on her. Not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn, but the active, forward-leaning attention of someone building something in their mind while they heard. "What would the right resource look like?" she said. He looked at her. "What?" "If it existed, what would it be?" He thought about it. He'd actually thought about it before, in the way you think about things you're not sure you're allowed to want. Speculative, half-formed. "Small centers," he said. "Not institutional. Nothing that looks like a hospital or a government office, because those environments activate exactly what you're trying to deactivate in a traumatized kid. Somewhere that feels like a house. Counselors with actual trauma-specific training, not just general child psychology. And people who've been in the field, first responders, veterans, people who understand what it looks like when the threat is over, but the body doesn't know that yet, to work alongside the clinical staff." Celeste was quiet. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you're planning something and you haven't decided yet whether to tell me about it." She looked at him. Then she said, "How many centers are we talking about to start?" "Celeste, I'm serious. 3? 5? I'm not asking you for anything. I was just telling you about a kid at Declan's school." "I know you weren't asking." She sat forward. "I've been looking for a way to make something real out of all of this. Daniel's death, Lila's recovery, the thing you did on that road. I've been sitting on money and resources, and I've been waiting to know what to do with them that wasn't just writing a check to an existing organization that already has its own shape." She looked at him with the focused clarity of a woman who had built 7 companies from decisions that looked to other people like risks, but felt to her like certainty. "This is the shape." He sat with it for a moment. "You'd need a clinical director, a real one, someone whose credentials, I know how to build a team. The model I'm describing isn't established. There's no playbook. You'd be building the framework from scratch. I've done that before. And the people you'd need, the ones from the field, they're not easy to find, and they're not always easy to work with. They come with their own stuff." "So do I," she said evenly. "So do you." He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had started a company at 25 with a loan and no safety net and had never once, as far as he could tell, let the scale of something stop her from beginning it. He thought about the boy in Declan's class going quiet. He thought about Lila in a hotel hallway, looking at a fire exit door. He thought about all the children in all the corridors of all the situations he'd moved through in 11 years of service who had nobody sitting down to their level, nobody with a coin and a story, and the specific patience of someone who understood that fear doesn't leave by force. 3 centers, he said. To start, Chicago, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, cities with the infrastructure to support the model and the population density to need it. Celeste already had her phone out. I'll call the attorney in the morning. It's 9:30 at night. He's used to it, yeah. The Lighthouse Hope Foundation was officially incorporated in June. Celeste handled the legal structure, the funding architecture, the board composition. 3 independent directors with backgrounds in child psychology, public health, and nonprofit management. And the negotiation for the first property, a former 2-flat in Rogers Park, that a developer had agreed to sell at below market after Celeste had a single conversation with him that Mason was not present for, and that she described afterward as straightforward. Mason handled the program model. He spent 3 months talking to trauma specialists, reading research he'd requested from academic contacts through people he knew, and developing the framework for what he kept calling, in his notes, the field clinical bridge, the integration of people with experiential knowledge of trauma and threat environments alongside licensed therapists in a physical space designed to feel nothing like an institution. Dr. Pham consulted. She did it initially as a favor to Celeste and continued because the model was, as she put it, filling a gap she'd been aware of for 15 years and had never had the resources to address herself. They hired a clinical director in August. Her name was Dr. Yolanda Marsh, a 44-year-old child psychologist from Detroit who had spent 12 years working with kids in gun violence aftermath programs and had a reputation, according to everyone Mason spoke to, for being brilliant and non-negotiable on questions of program integrity. She came to the interview having already read everything Mason had written about the model, annotated in the margins in red pen. The field clinical bridge is the right idea, she told them in the first 5 minutes. The implementation is going to be harder than this document suggests. We know, Mason said. The vetting for field staff has to be rigorous. You're going to have people applying who've been through genuinely significant experiences and have done zero processing of it. They'll think they're ready, and they won't be. I know, Mason said. She'd looked at him. Personal experience? Some. Then you know the difference between someone who's integrated what they've been through and someone who's using the work to avoid doing it. Yes. She'd looked at him for another second. Then she'd turned to Celeste. I'm in. The Rogers Park Center opened in November, 14 months after a little girl in a blue dress had looked into a stranger's eyes in a hotel hallway and said, "Did they make it home?" The opening was small. No gala, no press release, just a Friday afternoon with the staff, the board, Celeste and Mason and the kids, and Dr. Pham, who stood in the main room of what had been a 2-flat and was now something else entirely, and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "This is right." Lila had opinions about the paint colors. She expressed them at length. 2 of them were adopted. She accepted the 3rd loss with the pragmatic grace of someone who understood that advocacy sometimes required compromise. Declan stood in the corner eating a sandwich and watching his best friend instruct an adult about interior design with the fond, resigned expression of someone who had made his peace with this particular dynamic. Mason stood near the window and watched all of it. The kids, Celeste talking to Dr. Marsh near the bookshelf, the afternoon light coming through the new curtains, and felt the particular quality of a moment that you recognize while it's happening as one you'll carry for the rest of your life. Not because it's dramatic, because it's real. Because the thing you couldn't have imagined when you were sitting at your kitchen table at midnight with untouched whiskey and the weight of a highway in Belgium has turned out to be this ordinary, specific, particular thing happening in a Rogers Park living room on a Friday afternoon. Celeste appeared beside him. "How are you?" she said. "Good." He meant it simply, which was something he'd had to relearn, the ability to say good without the qualifier. "Really good." She leaned her shoulder against his, briefly, the way people do when they're standing next to each other and they want to say something without saying anything. He leaned back. "Lila's got them reconsidering the paint on the back hallway," she said. "I saw." She's not wrong, technically. She usually isn't. They stood together and watched the room. Declan had migrated toward the bookshelf and was explaining something to one of the board members who had made the mistake of asking about his interests. The board member looked slightly stunned, which was the normal response to a full Declan explanation of anything, and Lila was crouched in the corner near the window talking to Dr. Marsh with her hands moving expressively around the words, the way they did when she was excited about something. She still had the rabbit, Anchor, tucked under one arm, because some things you don't outgrow and shouldn't have to. She's going to be something, Mason said, not for the first time. He suspected he'd be saying it the rest of his life, watching that kid grow into the person she was already clearly going to be. She already is something, Celeste said. He looked at her. She was watching her daughter with the expression she'd had in the hotel hallway when she'd first heard Lila's voice, the one that was too large for just happiness, that had grief mixed into it, and relief and love and the specific texture of a woman who had been in the dark for a long time and was slowly, imperfectly, finding her way back toward light. "I know," he said. There's a thing about survival that nobody tells you while it's happening, because while it's happening, there isn't room for perspective. You're just in it, one foot and then the other, getting through the next hour, the next day, the next stretch of ordinary time that doesn't feel ordinary at all because the ordinary has been broken and you're living inside the break. What nobody tells you is that healing isn't the absence of the broken thing. The break is still there. Daniel Ashford was still gone, and Mason still woke from dreams about a Belgian highway, and Declan still had a grief he carried quietly the way children carry things they've learned to make room for. And Lila still had mornings when the weight of what she'd been through settled on her before she'd fully woken up. None of that disappeared. None of it was going to. What changed was the company you kept inside it. Mason had spent 3 years believing that what he'd survived had made him a liability to anyone he got close to, that the things he carried were weight he'd transfer, damage he'd spread, that the decent thing was to keep enough distance to protect people from the harder parts of who he'd become. He'd been wrong about that, in the particular way you're wrong about something when the belief protects you from something you're afraid to want. Celeste had spent 2 years building walls high enough to keep the grief contained, managing it, directing it, converting it into productivity and foundation structures and quarterly reports, because if she was moving fast enough, she couldn't feel how heavy the stillness was. She'd been good at it. She'd been so good at it that she'd almost convinced herself it was the same as being okay. What they'd given each other, which neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them would have asked for, and which had come anyway through a hotel hallway, and a worn coin, and a story about sailors, was the specific permission to stop managing so hard, to be imperfect and still be worth staying for, to have the bad nights, and the bad dreams, and the difficult mornings, and still be, when the morning resolved itself into day, someone who was present and trying and there. That was the thing about the lighthouse, Mason thought, on a December evening driving home from the Rogers Park Center with Declan asleep in the back seat and the city lights moving past the windows. The lighthouse didn't fix the storm. It didn't make the water still or the night short or the ship seaworthy if the ship had been through too much. It just said, here, this direction. The ground is here. You still had to sail the distance yourself. The light just meant you were sailing towards something real. He pulled up in front of the house. Declan stirred in the back seat, the particular animal awareness of a child whose body knows it's close to home. "We're here," Mason said. "I know," Declan said, the way he always said it, the reflex of a kid who doesn't want to admit he was asleep. He gathered himself, found his backpack, climbed out with the practiced efficiency of a 9-year-old who has done this 1,000 times. Then he stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at his father with Karen's dark eyes and said, out of nowhere, the way kids say the things that matter most, "I like who we are now." Mason looked at his son for a moment. "Me too," he said. Declan nodded, satisfied, and went inside. Mason stood on the sidewalk in the December cold for a moment, the city doing its city thing around him, indifferent and continuous, and he thought about a little girl who hadn't spoken in 742 days. He thought about a worn coin on a gray carpet. He thought about Celeste in the low light of her living room saying, "I'm not asking you to go anywhere," with the steady, careful courage of a woman who had earned the right to be afraid of things and was choosing, deliberately, not to be. He thought about Daniel Ashford going back into the fire because he couldn't do nothing, and about how the people we lose don't leave us clean. They leave us changed, and the change is the thing we carry forward, and what we do with the forward is the only part that's ours to write. He went inside. He turned on the kitchen light. He hung up his coat on the hook by the door and started the kettle, and he stood in his kitchen in the ordinary brightness of a Wednesday night and thought, this is it. This is the whole thing, not the dramatic version, not the redemption arc with the swelling music, just this. A kettle, a warm room, a child asleep down the hall, and the specific knowledge that tomorrow he would see the person he loved, and the kid who called his kid her best friend. And the day after that, he would go to Rogers Park and do work that was hard and necessary and real. He'd spent a long time thinking that survival was the goal, getting through, making it to the other side. He understood now that the other side was just another day. And another day was enough. Another day was, if you paid attention to what was in it, quite a lot. The kettle finished. He made a tea. He actually drank this time, standing at the counter in the quiet, and outside the December wind moved through the street, and the paper chain, the new one, Lila's rules, permanent, turned slowly on the cabinet hook, and the light was on, and the ground was solid, and he was home.